Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It is an enormous pleasure to welcome Michael Herzfeld, Professor of Anthropology at Harvard since 1991, one of the most distinctive and influential voices in contemporary anthropology, as everyone in this room knows perfectly well. I'm absolutely not going to say Professor Herzfeld needs no introduction, because then I would be robbed of my moment of being able to tell you, or remind everyone, that Professor Herzfeld has been in Harvard since 1991. But originally he was in our own department, where he did social anthropology in the late 60s, and at Oxford in the mid 70s. His many writings, all provocative, all insightful, all challenging, include The Poetics of Manhood, 1985, Anthropology Through the Looking Glass, A Place in History, 91, Social Production of Indifference. I could go on. I will go on. Cultural Intimacy, Social Poetics in the Nation State, 1997, Portrait of the Greek Imagination, my favorite, 1997, and Anthropology Theoretical Practice in Culture and Society, 91. He's had many awards and honours on both sides of the Atlantic, including the RAI's Dunn Prize and the Rivers Medal. His recent work is on comparison of the forms of historical experience in Europe and other cultures, and out of that comes his title tonight, which I hope I got right, Eviction and Evocation, The West at Home and Abroad, Ethnographic Reflections from Thailand and Southern Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I certainly wouldn't want to deprive you. And I must say it's a real pleasure to be back here. My early exit in the 60s was not a very distinguished one, and so I feel a little guilty almost standing here. On the other hand, I suppose that any students who might be worried about their exam results could take some courage from the fact that one does get invited back and forgiven. I was actually in the archaeology stream of the Tripos in those long-distant years, and I can only say that if there is anything good that comes out of my having become a social anthropologist, maybe it's the effect of a kind of grafting, you know, the long gestation, as it were, the frustrating long wait before I finally discovered that I could actually do what I wanted to do and become an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, and especially do field work. And I've done a lot of it, and it's really been the great pleasure of my professional life. Many years working in Greece, more recently in Italy and Thailand. And what I want to try to do today is to put a bit of the past and present of my own work together, because what I'm now trying to work on, aside from actually writing up the ethnographies of the districts in Rome and Bangkok where I'm working, and there's another project to think about the meaning of what it is to be a capital city, is actually to talk about not just what we mean by the West, that haunting category that never seems to go away but always causes great irritation, but more what it means for the people who have to live with the consequences of its domination. Now, of course, we also live with the consequences of that domination. But if we take the three countries in question, then the first of the two terms I want to talk about tonight, evocation, means very different things. The evocation of the West, in this case, means very different things in Greece, Italy, and Thailand, respectively. The question is, if we are going to evoke the past, for example, whom are we evoking it for? And who are the agents of that evocation? One of the most bizarre phenomena, I think, of the 21st century is the way in which the notion of heritage, a concept that after all is supposed to be very local, has actually become internationalized. Is it possible to have a form of heritage that is not simply a replica of some already Western created model? Obviously, the long history of Western dominance in global politics makes that very difficult. I won't try to answer the question of whether it's possible tonight, but what I am going to try to do is to talk about some of the practical consequences of the difficulty that we experience in that regard. I do want to make a particular historical point, and in this department where Jack Goody held sway for so long, it's also, I think, quite interesting to think about different ways of talking about that connection, because the notion of heritage is, of course, etymologically connected to inheritance. And there's the connection. And one forgets that when, for example, we look at the local terms for heritage, patrimoine in the French-speaking world, patrimonio in Italian, we're talking about something that's very specifically connected to a patrilineal model of inheritance. And that model has seeped into state politics in Europe and elsewhere in many different ways. When that term gets translated into other languages that don't have that particular history of kinship and inheritance, such as the Thai term moradok, one needs to look at what the legal notion of inheritance is in order to understand how this idea gets refracted. So there's, right there in the notion of heritage, there is a global project that is also irresistibly and irrevocably also local. And one really needs to try to understand the basis of the tension between these two levels. Actually, I think that's what ethnography does best. We look, in the immortal words of the Bard of Avon, we're ciphers to this great account. We're looking at great events and happenings, but through the prism of very, very local, detailed fieldwork. And for those of you who might be tempted to follow the siren call of multi-sited ethnography, but misunderstand its goal and think that this simply means you can do a bit of potted ethnography here and there, but ultimately no great subtlety is required. My view is that multi-sited ethnography is only really useful, and then it's very useful, when it actually connects very intense fieldwork experiences from a number of places. I don't think this is a place where I really have to preach that message, and I'm sure you all hear it all the time. But there is a bit of a fashion out there to think that this gives us an easy out now. We don't have to do all that long fieldwork. Actually, I think that the need for extended fieldwork is greater than ever, because more and more the world is covered with what looks like a Western coating of rather dubious and very generalized form, and recovering what is resistantly local becomes consequently more difficult. And all the more so, of course, as many people now do fieldwork in their own societies, or what they think of as their own societies, and especially in their own languages. For me, one very important motivation, in fact, for working in Thailand was the fact that since I've spoken both Italian and Greek since my teens, it actually became an interesting challenge to force myself into a completely different linguistic mode and try to figure out what that would actually do to my understanding of the ethnographic project. And so at the age of, ripe old age of 50, I started at something completely new. And, well, as you'll see, I have no regrets and no apologies, but it was certainly quite a shock to the system. Now, that's then the question of evocation, but I also want to talk more for a moment about the general context of the project that I'm trying to undertake here. I want to compare these three countries, and I'd like to characterize them in a somewhat caricaturish way, but I hope that you'll bear with that, because what I want to talk about is nation states as they have situated themselves in relationship to this idea of the West. Italy, I think, is probably fairly unambiguous about its membership in the West on the whole, but it's very dubious about whether it's really a country. And a country in which the national government is currently composed of two nationalist parties and one separatist one clearly has something of a problem with this question of national identity. Greece has no doubts that it's a country. Most Greeks are extremely loyal and patriotic and regard the national level as a paramount point of reference. But there are serious questions about whether Greece is part of the West or part of Europe, and of course, depending on people's political positioning, whether it even should be or whether they want to be. And that ambiguity provides an immediate point of contrast between Greece and Italy that is not of the kind that was presupposed in the old Mediterraneanist arguments, the old area studies models of Southern European societies. And finally, Thailand, a country that is geographically quite unambiguously outside the West and outside Europe, but which in fact converted itself from a very distinctive form of what Tambaya has called a galactic polity to a Western-style modern state with a lot of the trappings of Western culture, at least in the form of the way in which culture is publicly organized, and so protecting itself from the threat of invasion by the British and the French. And that process means that Thailand is actually, in many ways, a non-Western society in a very Western way, if that isn't too cute a paradox. And I think it does underscore some very interesting problems. Now, each of these countries displays aspects of these peculiarities in ways that are germane to the ethnographic project. Just to take language in Italy, Italy, I suspect, is the only country in Western Europe where, to this very day, the capital city speaks a dialect. The only people who would refuse to admit, by the way, that this is the case tend to be the fascists, because, of course, they're ultra-nationalist. But in Italy, if you go to Rome, the language you will hear most commonly on the streets is Romanesco. Now, where a Greek would say, at home we speak our dialect, but in public, milamita sosta ellinika, we speak correct Greek, an Italian is much more likely to say, a casa parliamo romanesco, at home we speak Romanesco, and in public, parliamo italiano, we speak Italian, so that the local dialect, even of the capital city, is placed on a par with the national language. And although the dialect is quite easily understood by somebody who has learned basically the standard language, it is also distinctive in interesting ways. Moreover, in the defense of cultural intimacy, Greeks tend to react very strongly at the national level, Italians much more at the local level. And perfect evidence for this in the fact that Greeks will always tell you Greek is a very, very difficult language and foreigners can't learn it, but Italians will not say that about Italian. However, it's considered to be very difficult for an outsider to learn a dialect because a dialect is more than a language, it's also a way of life. So there's a whole linguistic ideology caught up in this differentiation. I will admit to a streak of laziness in the sense that I decided to do my fieldwork in Bangkok partly because the thought of learning dialects that were tonally distinguished from each other was a bit daunting after dealing with European languages most of my life so far. Now, I want to make two other points of comparison, one between Greece and Thailand and the other between Italy and Thailand, just to try to complete this triangle a little bit more. The great similarity that I see between Greece and Thailand, and of course this is schematic, is that they are both examples of what I call crypto-colonialism. That is to say, they are both countries that were never officially under a Western colonial power, unless we count the short German occupation of Greece. But as countries, as whole entities, neither of them was ever actually fully occupied by any Western power, although Western powers bit off chunks of both at various points. This means two things. It means that they can boast of being the free spirit. Greeks always like to talk, Greek nationalist ideologues like to talk about the free spirit of the Greeks, and the Thai national historiography has it that the word Thai means free, although there is some evidence that it actually, and far back as I think the 14th century, meant something more like an indentured soldier. So even there, I think some doubts can be cast on this notion. But the notion of this freedom and the framing of it as independence from colonialism is itself couched in very Western colonial terms. Now, and we'll come back to shades of this crypto-colonial notion in a little bit. In the case of Thailand and Italy, I would point more to similarities in the very recent past, and particularly to what I would describe as neoliberal authoritarianism. Let me tell you a story. There was a man who decided that after a military or quasi-military career, he wanted to form a political party. He created that party and failed in the elections, but then he decided that nationalism was obviously the way to go, and so he created a nationalist party. He also associated it with an attack, a populist attack on the corruption of the old guard, regardless of whether they were academics or politicians, which in the particular country in question was often the same thing. And he actually won an election, but on the eve of that victory was himself accused by his enemies of corruption. There was considerable evidence, ironically, that this this knight on the white horse who was going after corruption was indeed quite corrupt, but of course, like every corrupt politician after his successful election, managed to arrange things under the table, and also the rumors go anyway. In any case, he was acquitted. Fortunately for him, because had he not been acquitted, he would have been debarred from running for office, for political office, for 10 years. After which, having achieved a substantial presence politically with a coalition government, he then proceeds to attack the press and attack the academic universe, and to try to cut down, particularly on the liberty of the press. Now, whom am I talking about? Well, if I say it's Thaksin, the Prime Minister of Thailand, some of you say, but surely you were talking about Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy. And of course, the answer is I'm talking about both of them. And I suggest that it is not coincidental that these two people have come to power at the same time, because they represent the victory of a certain kind of economic ideology that is also tied with the so-called rationalization, or perhaps, to use a term that Marilyn Strathern has made very popular, an audit culture perspective on knowledge, creating knowledge centers, putting much more faith in the technology of knowledge distribution than in the idea of open critical debate. And I think that's a very important change. We're seeing a great deal of this also, of course, in the United States and the United Kingdom. So, but I think that the cases of Thailand and Italy are dramatically so alike. In fact, one of the Thai English language newspapers spoke at one point about the Siamese twins, that this should cause us as anthropologists not to say, okay, let's become political scientists. Please not that. But let's think about what's happening at the local level where we do our field work as possible sources of explanation for these phenomena. So I do want to insist once again that the basis of all good anthropological comparison is ethnographic. In my own work, certainly when I was working exclusively in Greece, I would always try to draw in from what I learned about everyone from the Nur to, I don't know, India and so on, whenever it seemed relevant, quite eclectically. Now I'm in a position a bit more to draw on, autobiographically if you will, on ethnographic data collected. And the risk there, of course, is that I'm conditioned by each set of fieldwork to see certain things in terms of the previous fieldwork. But the advantage is that one can go back, especially these days, and actually pose these questions to local audiences and try to see what kinds of answers we get. Now, I have felt for many years that one of the best ways to get at the question of the relationship, the changing relationship between local people and national state structures, and now increasingly also international structures, is through historic conservation and its social impact. I first addressed this in some detail in one of the books that you were kind enough to mention, A Place in History, where I was interested in showing how in Greece the evocation of the past was an object of contestation. There were, first of all, those who wanted to emphasize the classical heritage and the European nature of the town where I was working, which was basically a town built by successively the Venetians and then the Ottomans, but using local labor. And so it's often very hard to see where the Venetian houses stop and the Ottoman ones begin. So if you didn't like your house, you said it's a piece of Turkish junk and it's an invitation to any Turkish invader to come over here, so let's get rid of it. But if you were thinking of turning your house into a nice romantic little hotel, you'd say it's a wonderful Venetian monument, and you'd go to the Archaeological Service and ask for financial assistance. And so, but then that was also crisscrossed by the politically more conservative party membership tending to edge anyway towards a more dramatically Philo-Western position, while those who lean towards the left, except in moments of national crisis, I have to say, would tend to emphasize their respect for the Ottoman and Byzantine heritage, although I have a sneaking suspicion that claims to respect for the Ottoman heritage were also a propaganda point to contrast against the way that the Turkish government was treating the Greek religious monuments in Cyprus, for example, but also part of what Paul Rabinow has correctly identified as a Western proclivity for framing pieces of Oriental architecture as monuments to Western liberalism. So That then was my original interest in this phenomenon. Now, in the case of Retinos, the town where I worked, you don't actually see very much eviction because most of these small houses are owned by the people who live there. And the gentrification is very gradual, and it's really a kind of self-gentrification. Also, this is a town that has sold its soul to some extent to package tourism, which means that although there's money coming in, the cultural changes tend to be rather small at the moment. That may change. But when people rent their properties, or when the state has the power to take over, sequester an area, then of course the situation changes dramatically. And it's these cases that I particularly want to describe today because this speaks to my new field work in both Rome and Bangkok. And here, of course, also you see a much more dramatic impact on everyday life, not only because if people are kicked out of their houses, they have to reformulate their entire collective social existence, but also because this kind of process induces a form of resistance that often takes the form of redesigning your own culture, becoming more Thai, becoming more Italian. And that process, ironically, taking place in countries that have, on the whole, been less overtly nationalistic in their international relations than Greece. But before I leave Greece, let me just give you the very simple example of the way that the landscape of modern Athens displays the ideological status quo. You have the Acropolis standing, as Eliana Yalouri in that wonderful book on the Acropolis points out, is kind of symbolic space in the nationalist canon, standing very free of any encumberments. Further down the Acropolis hill, however, there's what is often known as the old Turkish quarter, the Plaka, and a quarter that was built by islanders from the island of Anafi and then largely also settled by Asian Minor refugees, the Anafiotika. Anafiotika has now been very much gentrified, and the Plaka itself has become, as it has been for a very long time, in fact, a tourist haunt, although very much upgraded in recent years. And if you take that combination, you have an expression of Hellenism in the Acropolis and everything that is subsumed in the broad alternative vision that I sometimes refer to as the Romaic vision of Greek culture in the Byzantine and Ottoman remains, and then around behind, as far as the eye can see, up to the hill of Philopopos with its ancient monuments, 19th but mostly 20th century buildings making a claim on an aggressively Western idiom of modernity. Very different from Rome, where if you walk around in the Centro Storico, the old historic center, which is enormous, I mean, it's actually larger than the total city of Genoa, just to give you a sense of scale here, you see at every turn, layer upon layer of every period. There are none of these discontinuities. And if you talk to people, you'll discover that, for instance, taxi drivers turn into collectors of books about the history of Rome and can discourse as eloquently about medieval, Baroque, and 19th century Roman history as they can about its ancient past. So that there is, ironically, a much greater degree of continuity in the city that didn't have to fight to claim continuity with the ancient world, where Athens really was required to make that claim in order to, and this is something I've been talking about for years, of course, in order to make it possible for the Greek state to survive in the early years of so-called independence under Western tutelage. I might say that the histories of Greece and Thailand bear some remarkable parallels from more or less simultaneously blockades of the national capital's ports in the mid-1800s to the student revolutions that began massive anti-dictatorial change in 1973. Again, I suggest facts that suggest that global events with very local consequences were nonetheless producing also some structural similarities among these countries. Okay, now let me go very specifically to my fieldwork in Rome, where I'm living and I actually came from there a few days ago in the middle of a phase of fieldwork now, in the Rione Monti, which is the area roughly between Church of Santa Maria Maggiore and the Colosseum. I'm literally living about 3 minutes walk from the Colosseum, so I see it every day when I walk out. The ultimate symbol, if you will, of what Mussolini was so fond of calling Romanità, Romanness. Even, notice, a national fascist leader emphasizing Romanness as opposed to Italianità, Italianness, partly because he himself wanted to reproduce the Roman Empire in his own person, for which purpose he had a very large section of Monte, known as Marforio, gutted, so that he could then construct a very straight road going right through the ancient fora, called the Via dei Fori Imperiali, which became then his ceremonial procession way between Piazza Venezia and the Colosseum. And that sventramento, as it's called in Italy, literally the gutting out, the emptying out of the center by Mussolini of significant chunks of population, to go and live in suburbs where they would mostly live in very large buildings with a single entrance where they could be kept under surveillance, was the beginning of the process that I'm now seeing in a very different form in the beginning of the 21st century. But this was certainly to do with Mussolini's notions, described, for example, in David Horn's book, Social Bodies, of the importance of a kind of cleansing of the city of the so-called dangerous elements, mainly the working classes and particularly those segments of the population that were apt to embrace left-wing ideologies. Needless to say, this created even larger groups of left-wing resistance, but dictators tend not to notice those consequences too quickly. Now, this notion of Romanità was very crucial to Mussolini's reign, and you will recall that many of his symbols, including, of course, the fasces in ancient Rome, they were the bundle of axes carried by the lictors, who were legal officials. And even today, you still see the SPQR on manhole covers, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the motto of the Roman polity. And of course, since the Roman emperors were not bothered by the fact that the motto didn't mention them because their power was taken for granted, Mussolini had no problem with that either. Now, one of the peculiarities of Rome is that the people who live there tend to rent rather than own their property. This is true of many large cities, of course, but it's very different from the situation I was looking at in Rethymno, where most, as I said, of the people were owners, and where therefore the question of inheritance, who got what from whom, and the rules of inheritance were very important also for understanding the ideological division of labor that led some people to want to get rid of their houses and others to cash them in, as it were, as a great resource. Now, the situation in Rome has been much complicated by two legal changes. One under the left-wing coalition that, until Berlusconi came to power, was the dominant force in Italian politics after the fall of the Christian Democrats, and which bizarrely, but of course in the land of Tony Blair you're used to this kind of thing, liberalized the market and also, and at the same time, made it much easier for landlords to kick out their delinquent tenants. Then, under the present government, there was a push towards getting rid of a large number of buildings that had been inherited by government at many different levels from so-called enti morali. These were often buildings that had been left to social security institutions, churches, all sorts of, and many of them government institutions, as they say, as bequests, and which, under the law, the government could then only push people out of completely, having first given them the option of buying out their own apartments within that building. And the new law that then came in said, if the new owner wants to get everybody out and restructure the whole building, then that right disappears automatically. In other words, then nobody can resist the power of the entrepreneurial builder, constructor, who wants to come in, take over the whole building, restructure it in a way that will make it infinitely of greater value, and thereby make a financial killing. Now this, of course, was a perfect invitation to the mafia. And whereas it is said that there is at least an unspoken accord between the mafia and the Vatican, that until recently said the Vatican has no real power outside the Aurelian walls, the ancient walls surrounding the Centro Storico, but the mafia does not interfere internally. And 70% or so of the real estate within the Centro Storico actually belongs to the Vatican or to individual churches. A very strange situation considering that the Vatican is an independent state, but there it is. It's mostly surrogate ownership anyway. This is beginning to break down because now, of course, the mafia is starting to speculate. And in fact, in Monte, there are now 2 buildings that are under investigation by the Anti-Mafia Commission. Now, if the mafia eventually wins in the sense that somebody can be bribed not to pursue this right to the end, they will also have gained a great deal, because during the period of time that these buildings are under lock and key, their value continues to rise, potentially, and the owners are not spending any money on the restructuration. The restructuration, the cost of restructuring will not rise as fast as the value of real estate, because as mafiosi and other underworld characters have a lot of money they need to get rid of quickly and hide, the best way to do it is to invest it in buildings, which can then be passed on very quickly. And one advantage of passing them on is that you can create the company that you sell them to, thereby creating the fiction that now there's no previous obligations that attended on the original sale apply, and so there's a huge round of speculation going on with the deep suspicion that many of these are quite fictitious transfers, that actually the people involved are always the same. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of them. This is a palazzo, as they call rather nicely any block of apartment block, in a street called Via degli Bernesi. This is a famous case because the people in it have resisted eviction for something like 14 years. Now, the quote-unquote original owner was the Bank of Rome, which was very much involved in various kinds of social services to the city and also in historic construction. Actually, they put a lot of money into the recent restoration of parts of the Colosseum. And like Caesar's wife, wanted to be above suspicion. When I first came on the scene, they were the official owners, and I didn't realize at that point that one of the reasons that the Bank of Rome didn't manage to push people out was that it was simply too embarrassing, even though they kept trying. The Bank of Rome, however, that part of it had originally been the Cassa di Risparmio, which was an exchange bank that was part of the Bank of the Holy Spirit, the Banca di Santo Spirito, which of course was part of the Vatican. So right there we have some very interesting leads, quite untraceable. Documentation is not to be found in any source that I'm aware of. The inhabitants, the residents, did try to find this, but in any case, the Bank of Rome, at any rate, while it wasn't behaving particularly well, did not resort to violence, and every time there was a threat that the prefect would be brought in and would bring in the police force. And let me tell you that out in the suburbs of Rome, there have been some very violent eviction scenes with the police coming in and just smashing everything in their sight, including people. They're not going to do it in the heart of the historic city under the eyes of scandalized tourists or of local residents who might be aware these things go on in the outskirts, but certainly would refuse to invest their money in any bank that did it right under their noses. At least that, again, I'm going partly by what people said was going on. Now, at some point, enter the anthropologist, and actually I was a bit worried because I discovered that the couple that was leading the resistance was interestingly politically split. The wife came from a right-wing neo-fascist Alleanza Nazionale family. The husband came from a long line of die-hard communists. But because the left wing was very embarrassed by its recently constituted legislation on these matters, which had certainly contributed already to its defeat in the national elections, they were getting much more support from the so-called social right, which is linearly descended from Mussolini's fascists, even if they now deny that past. And so I said to the man, the husband, look, I know somebody who's in the Green Party, he might be able to get a couple of other people involved from the left coalition, because they wanted to have a press conference to dramatize their case. And we had the press conference, and I found myself seated at the table, fortunately, at the far end, from the deputy chairman of the Alleanza Nazionale, the neo-fascist party, the representative of one of the unions representing tenants throughout Italy, a member of the Democrats of the Left, which is basically the old Communist Party of Italy, the senator from the Green Party, who was my contribution to this, as it were, and by the way, an anthropologist, and interestingly, her specialty is Native Americans, and one of the favorite metaphors of these people as they find themselves under siege is, we feel as if we're living in an Indian reservation and we're about to be kicked out. So that's perhaps not entirely coincidental either. In any case, we held the conference, and some journalists showed up. There were, I think, probably more anthropologists than journalists, but still. But it got into the papers, people talked about it, and once again, this had a delaying effect. At any rate, I think the bank finally decided, every time we try to get rid of these people, these wretched anthropologists and politicians and whoever else show up and make it difficult for us. So we better sell it to someone else. So they sold it to a very large real estate company that also has other interests in the country, which then sold it to a company that was run by a couple of Jewish entrepreneurs. Now, the Jewishness of the entrepreneurs is only relevant here in the sense that in Rome, the Jewish community is regarded, even by those on the political right, as being the core of the oldest part of the population. It has a record of continuous inhabitation in Rome since 70 AD, and because the Jewish community obviously did not approve of the activities of these two of its members, and in fact at various points had tried to exercise a restraining influence because some of the victims of their activities were members of the community itself. Despite the efforts of the chief rabbi and of the community leader, for a long time the company said it wasn't going to do anything, and particularly it refused to accept an agreement that had been signed in the Capitol in front of the mayor by another company, by the previous owner, by the previous company. And this was the second time, because the previous company had also, of course, benefited from the fact that the bank decided very suddenly to sell without warning the residents that they might have a chance to buy out their apartments. So the agreement signed in the Capitol was that the choice would be made, the offer would be made to the residents that if they could get enough money together, they would be allowed to buy the apartments at a reasonable rate. And it was apparently an affordable rate. But every time that looked as if it was about to happen, suddenly there was a change of ownership. At one point, this company that, as they say, was at odds with its base community, sold it to another company, which then disappeared, ceased to exist a week later, by which time the property had gone to its present owner. So I think it's very clear that what's happening, although one could never prove it, is there's a great deal of collusion among those companies who have a major interest in trying to raise the prices as quickly as possible in order to increase the value of their holdings. And one part of the way that this is carried out is through very thinly veiled threats. People show up and say, oh yes, well this looks like a nice house, I think we're going to do this apartment this way, and generally talking as if they were already in, and then showing up and saying, well, we're here with the removal van, are you ready? And things of this kind, and offering just enough money to pay for the transportation of people's goods to another site. All of which is understood locally as typical mafia tactics. Now, this doesn't mean that these are in any official or formal sense mafiosi, but there are also ways of playing with stereotypes. Somebody will say, ci penso io, let me think about this, meaning I'm going to get you. Right? It's a very polite way of saying it. Or a certain kind of elaborate, rather Baroque politeness that is often associated in people's minds particularly with the Sicilian mafia. Or the exaggerated use of, for example, a Neapolitan accent at a time when the Camorra, the Neapolitan equivalent of the mafia, has been very much in the news. So one could never really tell This is the anthropologist's classic dilemma, whether these organizations were genuinely involved or not. But the fact that people clearly believe it has a very depressing effect on their will to remain and resist. And particularly at a time when people believe that the government itself is very much in cahoots with the same kinds of financial forces. So then, of course, along comes the Alleanza Nazionale again, exploiting the situation and saying, we are very much trying to help you, but the mayor, who is a left-wing mayor, ignores the situation. And the real problem, of course, is that you're pushed out of these houses and all these immigrants are coming in. And there's particularly strong resentment in this area against immigrants from Eastern Europe. And also interesting, because remember that at the moment there is a Polish pope. Now, the Alleanza Nazionale is formally and on the surface very pro-Catholic and pro-Vatican. So there's a double-level attack here. The official discourse is that we, as good Catholics, believe that the heritage should be preserved for our long-standing association with the Church, while at the local level, there is an implicitly racist and sometimes quite explicitly racist attack on immigrants. And so people who had been quite left-wing and now find themselves dispossessed of their homes are often tempted to throw in their lot with these left-wing forces. So it's quite a complicated story. There are many ironies in this. The right-wing regional administration is threatening to evict from a building it owns a local club that is actually mostly comprised of right-wing members. And so there may be a swing there to the left very, very soon. It's hard to know. Given the flexible nature of Italian politics, however, following this process is necessarily a part of what one wants to analyze at the ethnographic level. Now, all of this is very different from the situation I was looking at in Bangkok, because in Rome I was looking at the action of non-government agents involved in what were technically illegal activities, and in a situation that was further refracted through political differences expressed by the aggressive display of political party slogans and flags. In Thailand, you never protest with a political flag. You protest with the national flag and the portrait of the king and queen, because in Thailand, political protest always entails emphasizing national loyalty and yourself as its best representative. And I think that's a major and important difference that I want to emphasize. In the community of Pommahakan, which is a community of 282 people living in the center of the old part of Bangkok, actually right on the edge of on the wall, but living between the wall and a canal. For those of you who know Bangkok, it's very close to the Democracy Monument and even closer to the Pan Phar Bridge off Ratchadamnern Avenue. The people of this community, it's a very small community, their problems stem from the fact that they are sitting on a piece of prime real estate in the middle of an area that by royal decree has been announced as a park site that will form part of the total restoration of the old dynastic city. Now, that restoration project is a totally Western notion in the sense that it involves planning principles that produce large amounts of space where nobody's living, the eradication of markets, and then the framing of bits of classically Thai architecture, but most particularly, in fact, in the overwhelming percentage of the buildings that are slated for removal, buildings constructed during the reign of Rama V, who, of course, was the great architect of Thailand's westernization. Okay, now this larger scheme then is something that involves royalty, and that makes it very difficult to talk about because there is a very severe lèse-majesté law, and indeed one of the politicians who recently tried to help the community has just been accused of lèse-majesté. And this is somebody through whom I actually have a very close connection with the current mayor, so I'm a little nervous about what the next move is going to be. But I have to say, I don't really think that, I think the point is that you accuse people of lèse-majesté as a way of saying they're being less good Thais. Well, there's a complicated story there as well. Now, Bangkok is a patchwork of ownership. Some bits of it, not this park, are owned by the Crown Property Bureau, which is basically under the King's authority, and which used to see its role as being more or less a charitable institution. So rents were minimal, quite nominal, and there is another faction, however, that is gaining power within the Crown Property Bureau that says we should invest this land wisely because this will provide then an independent source of income for the royal family and for the many indeed truly worthy projects that the royal family supports. So there's already a split right there among people who profess to be supporting the interests of the royal house. And the municipality of Bangkok owns the land in Port Mahakam, but it didn't always. It bought out a number of individual owners because the Crown Property Bureau and an independent committee set up to develop this conservation project was putting pressure on the municipality to get the people out so that a park could be constructed specifically in honor of Her Majesty. At one point, the residents retaliated by setting up a garden and dedicating it to the honor of Her Majesty, pointing out that it was not necessary for them to be pushed out in order to pay homage in an appropriate form. The authorities then sent in 100 soldiers who proceeded to dig up the garden and dumped a huge pile of muck from the cleaning up operation before the recent APEC meetings in Bangkok right next to it, at which point the residents, very intelligently I thought, took the muck and dug it into what was left of the garden as a way of saying this is actually quite useful and thank you very much. Very cooperative. Everything is done very much in terms of we can make things work together. And the favorite political word in this context is participation. Indeed, they use the English word. Now, time is running out and I want to give you a bit more of the ethnographic detail. But let me say that some of the most interesting things about this community are that in the over 10 years now that they've been struggling to stay put, they have developed their own democratic institutions because the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration does not recognize their legitimacy as a community. Women in the community have become much more important as leaders and activists, and they also, of course, have always played an important part in the financial life of the community and have been very important in setting up a rotating credit fund. And then most recently in 2004, I attended approximately 4-hour-long meetings at which the community, now self-divided into 5 units, discussed using models and a big map the kind of housing that they would like to put up if they were restricted just to 1/5 of the park area. Their land sharing scheme suggested that it would actually be possible for them to do that, and they had a lot of advice from architects, from town planners, and so on, none of whom, of course, were associated with the government. Now, the previous governor of Bangkok simply refused to listen to anyone. I never got anywhere near him. I was told to keep away from Pomahakam by the chief clerk, because Pomahakam was reputedly infested with drug addicts. In fact, it's one of the very few places in Bangkok that successfully and on its own dealt with the drug problem in a non-violent fashion, persuading the pushers to leave or stop, and also, and at the same time, allowing a couple of the very old ones simply to die of natural causes, and watching out for evidence that, for example, children were having access to drugs in a way that is totally transparent. This community guards itself, and I would argue sets a kind of model for community living that would work very well in Bangkok if it were not for the fact that it happens most inconveniently to be sitting on this land. So one point I've tried to make in my own beginner's attempts at journalism in Thailand was to say, look, if you want to push all these people out, you're inviting the drug pushers back in, because a space between a thick perimeter wall and a canal is perfect, as we know from the example of New York's Central Park, for example, and in fact any large park area in the United States and in many parts of Western Europe as well. So if you're interested in being serious about the drug problem, why not build from these grassroots activists who have a real interest in protecting their own place? Now, nobody in the BMA, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, listened until August, when suddenly there was an election and the underdog, won a smashing victory, and he is a representative of, and now a rising star in the main opposition party, which then proceeded to get very badly beaten in the last national elections. But he is something of a media star. He's a former businessman with somewhat left-wing credentials. He was involved in some of the student movement, so he has an interesting managerial plus populist plus left-wing style, and has a very different manner. And he, in fact, set up a committee to talk to the community. But even now, I fear that partly for legal reasons and partly because there are serious problems about simply getting people to see why having a community like this is important, they may not succeed. Let me just tell you a couple of things that will show why this kind of community doesn't appeal to bureaucrats. First of all, it has a lot of little shrines which are dedicated to particular ancestors. The BMA would have come in and raised all of those to the ground and removed them, and a number of trees that are sacred trees, they're Bodhi trees. But the residents retaliated to that one by saying, or responded to that one by saying, well, actually, these shrines and trees represent the ancestors of all Thai people. And they began to speak in the language of Thai nationalism, because that was the only level at which they could then defend themselves against these kinds of criticisms. And they spoke a great deal about how they were Thai people too. When it became clear that this wasn't working terribly well, I said to one of the leaders, well, you know, one of the things you should emphasize is the fact that you're very typical of Bangkok, and so you should talk about diversity. Because if you don't talk about diversity, if you talk about diversity, I should say, then maybe they will realize that if they throw you out because you're of mixed origins, people come from many different parts of the country, they would actually have to expel the entire population of Bangkok. So suddenly the word diversity started getting big in the community as well. Now, I talked to one of the bureaucrats in the BMA, and he had an interesting point. He said, this isn't really a community. They come from all over the place. And you know, in Thailand, we define communities as groups of people who came together out of a single profession. And many of you will know, there are, for example, villages that produce only paper umbrellas or only bowls and so on. And so this isn't a community. What do they produce? And I said, well, they, for example, pride themselves on the variety of different kinds of Thai food they produce and sell. Oh yeah, they're just sellers, they're not producers. They don't really produce it. They don't grow it themselves, he said. So I then began to feel a bit mischievous, and I said, oh, you mean this is like, your vision of a community is like the Prime Minister's OTOP policy. Now, OTOP is actually a partly English acronym, meaning OTOP, one tambon, which is an administrative unit, one product. The rather, I suppose one might almost say, Stakhanovite image that the current Thai government is trying to promote is that every village or every district should produce a single product. And then it all comes to Bangkok and we have big displays, and of course, especially in those places that used to be the local markets, which are being destroyed to make way for some of those display places. And to my astonishment, and I must admit chagrin, he agreed enthusiastically, and he said, oh yes, that's exactly right, as if he was patting a rather silly young schoolboy on the head. In fact, this is the problem, that they do see community in terms of this neoliberal production image that is designed for the efficiency of production and reduces cultural diversity to similar terms. And replaces the notion of the market as a place where you have a lot of people who are not really competing with each other but collaborate. If you go to Thai markets, it's still very striking how you'll get clusters of 20 shops all selling more or less the same thing and helping each other rather than being in overt competition, replacing this again with a capitalist model of competition controlled by the state in this case. So what we see then in this case is a community that is increasingly inclined to emphasize things like local traditions, but they're not local because some of them came from the south or from the northeast. It's food, which again came from all over the country. And the response even of a senior official in the present BMA was, well, not only do they not really have a single profession that identifies them as a community, but they're not even a minority, which might make it possible for us to do something. In other words, they are neither subject to the advantages of requiring a kind of political correctness, nor are they in line with the official image of what a community should be. Now, what you see in both the Rome and the Bangkok cases then is that people who would actually police their own communities, not in some punitive sense, but in controlling access so that, again, drug users and pushers couldn't get in, children didn't get attacked by drunken older people and so on. And Rome has a very serious problem of petty theft. One of the things that the old artisanal, what they call the case bottega, the house upstairs and the shop downstairs, was a great way of making sure that people couldn't sneak into a street and then start pickpocketing without somebody catching them at it. And the typical artisanal arrangement of the Thai house was also to have the living quarters right next to or above the workspace. So again, you have this kind of arrangement. Again, the logic of the new market is pushing these people out, and with it destroying also the form of residence that gave community life to the area. Now, nobody, I would hope, no anthropologist these days would want to say that change is necessarily a bad thing and should not happen. And certainly I'm not such a person. But when change is dictated by the mass production of an image of national identity that is yoked to a kind of economic machine in which it is then suggested that the people who are being relocated should become cogs, I become profoundly disturbed. The present deputy governor has said, for example, that one thing that the administration can do, and I think she means entirely well, for the inhabitants of Pom Mahakan, if they're not able to stay, is to provide them with job retraining. Well, job retraining? I mean, what are they going to be trained to do? Presumably, since the government also wants to decentralize the whole area, pull all of the government offices out and turn Ratchadamnern Avenue into, as the Prime Minister has boasted, the Champs-Élysées of Asia. Therefore, we have to find probably factory work or something of that kind for these people. And I want to argue that in any case, he's not going to create the Champs-Élysées of Asia. First of all, because if you want to visit the Champs-Élysées, it's probably still better to go to Paris. But if there is a parallel with the European capital, the present state of that main street, Ratchadamnern Avenue, that runs straight past Pom Mahakan, is in fact with the Via dei Fori Imperiali in Rome. There is, however, one important difference. There's no Colosseum at the end of it, although there is the Grand Palace. There are certainly no forums on either side of it, as there are in the Roman case. So that the desire to create something there is a kind of Disneyland on the one hand, but also then a very expensive shops marketing the products of this OTOP policy. This is all part of the plan. And if you look at the architectural plans for the Ratchadamnern Avenue development, there is the park, the lung space, even though there's another one not very far away, in place of Pom Mahakan. Not, let me add, a park with sculpted buildings and trees and so on, but an empty lawn with a balustrade running around it. Nothing else. A perfect cover behind that wall for all sorts of clandestine activities. And nobody there to watch out. And then on either side of the main street, shops that will replace the present mixture of restaurants, offices, and so on, and which will mostly be designed to attract foreign capital, which is, without any question, a necessity for the Thai state. Nobody's arguing about that. But my question is, why does this have to be done at the expense of local populations? And why does the government not understand that it is reproducing itself precisely the problem that the underworld control, increasing underworld and speculatory control of the old city of Rome is producing there, namely that you are getting, I mean, Rome has a major crisis now. Even 4 years ago, it was reckoned that about 12,000 people were being made homeless every year. That number has multiplied many times over now. Think what that means in a city of 3 million. We're not talking about a huge city. And the discontent and bitterness that was created by the original gutting, the original sventramento of Mussolini's years is being reproduced many times over, and even more dangerously is being seen as a failure of democratic movements, with the only political heroes emerging, the far-right Alleanza Nazionale. In Bangkok, the same danger is likely to arise. Pom Mahakan is tiny, 282 people. The Ratarakosin Island, which is the entire area of the old dynastic capital, runs to tens of thousands of people of many different social classes. Some of them can afford to leave and take their property with them and sell out, but most of them will lose their access to their current principal modes of livelihood. And once again, you would be creating, I'm reminded of Tacitus, I think it was, who talked about how, what was it, the Roman army created a desert and called it peace. What we're getting here is the creation of a dead zone, which is being called then a cultural monument. We can get a little bit of a sense of what it will look like by going to the very pretty twin fort. Pom Mahakan is a little fortress, and that's Pom in Thai means a fort, at Pom Pasumen, which is just really up the road from there, which was cleared out. It didn't have too many inhabitants, but it had a lot of trees. There is now a bronze plaque proclaiming in very bad English and very stilted Thai the achievements of the authorities in creating a park from which the trees were removed. Creating a park from which, or a zone from which the people have been removed in the name of social reform strikes me as equally paradoxical. So, eviction and evocation. Well, we see in both cases the development of forms of resistance. Those resistances in Rome now have failed. In Bangkok, I think there's a very real possibility that they will fail. There are also differences in the forms of resistance, and it's in the resistance that you see that something that my colleague James Watson pointed out in a more lighthearted vein when he talked about McDonald's in East Asia, that even though it looks the same, the way people interpret it locally may be different. And in many ways, it seems to me that these state policies are attempts to eradicate precisely that difference. So the irony is that what makes Thailand, for example, interesting and different is actually the target of a government that is trying to promote Thai culture. Again, often I believe with very good intentions, but the planning that has been absorbed is also subject to some of the more old-fashioned forms of planning imperatives, such as the idea that if you, for example, have a plan, it has to have a certain set time. So we don't plan to make people self-sufficient. We build something new, and we set a period, let's say, of 5 years in which to do it, after which devil take the hindmost, which, again, is not good social planning, even if it puts a lot of money into the hands of architects. A devaluation, I should say, of the idea of culture. When the leader of the left-wing opposition recently attacked Mr. Berlusconi, Berlusconi responded by saying, well, what do you expect from a professor? And we should all take this very seriously, of course. The response was that Mr. Berlusconi is showing the low level of culture he has, which plays into the hands of populist rhetoric, and it's actually a very dangerous way to go along with it. The leader of the most vocal critic, let's say, in Thailand is actually an anthropologist, a man called Thirayut Bunmi, and Professor Thirayut has frequently been attacked by the Prime Minister, who increasingly is inclined to make fun of him as a way of building up his appeal, and at the same time discrediting academic knowledge. Our knowledge as anthropologists is particularly at risk, and that's why we also have a stake, I think, in this kind of issue. Because what we study, and here I want to bring everything to a bit of a conclusion, what we study is not the grand models of culture, but the way that people negotiate any kinds of models of culture and society, what they use them for and how they operate with them. And it is precisely the diversity of these phenomena that attracts our interest and gets us derided for getting bogged down in too many unimportant local differences. In order to argue against that, as I say in my journalistic attempts, I have argued for what I call the importance of a small community. In Rome, I've also worked with a very limited number of people intentionally, because the tight, narrow focus of real ethnography, if I can call it that, and I don't mean that one has to do it in a village in the middle of nowhere, and I'm certainly not doing it in villages in the middle of nowhere at the moment. But the tight focus of long-term ethnography allows us to see that the evocation of a past that is then used to justify eviction is really nothing more than a new ideological argument for a phenomenon against which local populations have less and less power to work. I found myself for the first time in my life working in Rome and now increasingly in Bangkok becoming an activist. This kind of journalism, for example, is something I'd never done before. I'm not saying we should be activists. I'm not a particular fan of applied anthropology. But I think that today anthropology has very little excuse for not being engaged, which is quite a different concept. And so I want to end this talk with an appeal to everyone here to think about what it is that we do that can be most useful to the people we study. It may not be the things that they themselves initially identify. I remember some years ago at a conference actually here in Britain, an ASA decennial conference at Oxford actually, a couple of colleagues from so-called third world countries were complaining that the academics had been talking about things that were not particularly relevant to their lives. And at that time, Professor Tim Ingold made the very, I thought, apposite response, that even if we did nothing else, teaching anthropology is something that is itself highly applied. But I would go much further. I'd say that when we become involved in fieldwork in the way that I am in these two places, we're not only engaged in a rather, shall we say, active and agent-oriented form of reflexivity that allows us to see the political significance of what we're doing, we may, just may, be able to help those people without whom our profession would not exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know there will be many questions. You have very kindly offered to enter into discussion. May I suggest that I provide that stool for you, and I will crouch on top of this, because otherwise I can't see people who wish to ask questions, and I'm sure you would like to crouch. Well, if you like.
Thank you very much.
And I will come and crouch here, otherwise I can't see you. Both of you will be asking questions. See if this is going to work.
And I would like to make an appeal that you make your questions loud, because I'm a little hard hearing and it would help.
If I may take the chair's privilege and start, I was actually going to ask you to comment more about advocacy and activism, but you've already begun to comment on that, although it would be very interesting to hear you reflect further about dilemmas you've had in situations in which you would be somewhat hesitant to pursue the role of anthropologist as advocate. Are there problems, are there limitations, and are there situations in which this would be really rather bad advice to give our students? The other question, if you want to pursue a second question, would be about what you had in the title under, I think it was the phrase, the West at home. And I'm wondering, perhaps in connection with your comments about advocacy, you want to push a bit more about the role of that concept, the West. Since your talk was so very much an indication of the strengths of comparison, pluralizing ethnographic experience, I'm wondering whether what you would really perhaps have wanted to do with that title is to pluralize your definition of West and really talk about vernacularizing or pluralizing Wests in your settings.
Oh, thank you. I actually feel that those were the sorts of questions that we didn't have any collusion, but just let me assure everyone, because these are exactly the kinds of things I do actually think are very important. Talk about dilemmas, yes. The most obvious dilemma, of course, is how do I know that what I'm doing is really good for someone? Now, I think that anthropology is actually a very lonely discipline. In the end, we cannot... Whole subject in the States, and I believe it's coming in Britain now, to ethics committees that try to legislate what an appropriately socially responsible way of doing our research can be. And they're often dominated, by the way, by clinical psychologists who haven't the faintest idea what we do. And it's a very dangerous piece of the audit culture to be resisted critically and positively, because obviously anything that does help to protect our informants from the consequences of our work is something we should support. Having said that, yes, I mean, there are dilemmas because my activism could in some cases have consequences of a sudden shutdown. Actually, I think we tend to think that we're more important than we are. We're little bit players, and we should play those bits, but they're not going to be drastically important. There are many other academics who are involved in this Bon Mahakan site. We've actually had 2 major conferences in the space of a year when I was there doing my major field work at the two major Bangkok universities. And there are very large numbers of students combing the site and talking to people, and this has certainly also helped to publicize matters. So I'm just doing a bit of it, and I'm happy to use the prestige that goes with my home institution in support of those people, particularly I don't think my home institution always behaves in the same way, and I'd like to offer some kind of counterweight, as some of you have read about the antics of our president, for example. So I think that is one of the dilemmas one faces. Of course, there's also the question of, do you have a right to muck about in another person's country or other people's country? Now, in Italy, I feel I am, after all, an EU citizen. I'm a British citizen, and I've been told repeatedly that if I wanted to, I could even stand for election as mayor. I think that being an anthropologist is quite hard enough, and besides, I wouldn't want to have to deal with all those anthropologists, but anyway, and others. But therefore, I feel that in a legal sense, I do actually have a right to be involved, and that hasn't been challenged. In Thailand, I take my lead from people whom I respect. But when I say that anthropology is lonely, I mean that I still have to decide whom I respect and why. And that responsibility, that buck stops right here. I can't ask somebody else to make that decision for me. So when I hear that some people, for instance, feel that it's a bit awkward that this foreigner is mucking around here, I have to think about who those people are. If they're the bureaucrats, it means I've trodden on a nerve in a way that might be helpful for the community. Once, for example, I actually told a fairly senior bureaucrat off for his lack of manners because he started talking in his cell phone at precisely the moment when I started speaking in a public meeting. And the residents were a bit worried about the consequences, but in fact, I think it had the effect of making him more polite both to them and to me. And not just polite, but he actually became quite helpful in the next meeting that we had with him. So there are moments when you have to make a decision. It could go wrong. You've got to be prepared to stay in there and live with the consequences of your mistakes as well. And that's what I mean when I say that it's a lonely profession. I do have something to say about that actually in cultural intimacy, because that's the example I use there is my involvement in defending the right of people to say things about Greece's Macedonian policy that were not popular with the government. And the question is, do you defend the minority against the government and risk hurting a government that is weak precisely because it's a client state of the two countries that you're most involved in, namely, grew up in the UK and I'm living in the US, or do you take the view that a government is a strong institution and these minorities are very small? I took the latter view, and I take the responsibility for what flows from that. In fact, I don't think any harm was done. So, there are also dilemmas. I mean, when you write a book I wrote a book about sheep thieves. Now, some irresponsible individual apparently then revealed the name of the community because he wanted to show off probably, that he was very clever. He wasn't an anthropologist. It didn't have any bad consequences of which I'm aware. And I did write the book very carefully. But again, had this had any public consequences, I would have denounced him, and I also would have made it as embarrassing as I could for anyone in Greece actually to go in and humiliate the community on the basis of what I'd written. If we take the case of, say, Napoleon Chagnon and the famous, the El Dorado affair and all of that, my quarrel with Chagnon is not that he wrote a book called The Fierce People. I think that you can't predict how a title of a book is going to be taken. My quarrel is the fact that when the local government took it as a license to commit genocide, he didn't then launch a campaign against that, which is what I hope I would do in those circumstances. So there are dilemmas, and there are a lot of, also, the question of whether you are more respectful of national rights or of community rights, which obviously in these cases is very important. I believe that everything that I do in Thailand, for example, reflects a deep respect, not only for the Thai people, but for some of their institutions. I have friends who are members of the royal family. It is a very remarkable family. There are many people I know who disagree with the institution of monarchy. That's not the issue. I do not like to see the royal family used for purposes that I know some of its members would not be very happy with. And so when people are accused of lèse-majesté as a political tool, it seems to me that this is actually something that perhaps one should comment on. At the same time, I have no desire to embarrass my Thai friends or even Thais who may not like what I do. So there are compromises that one has to make. But the bottom line for me is that there have been some moments in the community in Pom-Mahakam that were deeply emotional. Actually, one of the worst moments I had recently in Rome, just last Sunday, when after 14 years of struggle, the leaders of this group in the Palazzo signed documents surrendering because they could no longer, ironically it now looked as if the Bank of Rome had treated them much better than these speculators. I'm hoping that even though the Pom-Mahakam community has now lost its last legal appeal, that the governor will hear our appeals, and I am actually about to write him a letter. And this is showing respect for the institutions, and he's actually a very remarkable man. I don't know if he has the freedom or the ability to make that decision. I also understand that there might be reasons for him to make a decision that he would regard as valid. But I have a feeling that I did not have with the previous governor, that writing that letter at least will be seen and heard. And if nothing else, it says to the people of Pom-Mahakam what I promised them when I first went to work there, that if you are kicked out of there, we are now friends. I'm going to come and see you. This is not something that I'm just doing for my research. And that maybe is the final question that we should all ask ourselves. If it's just about research, never mind what happens to the people we study, then I think it's unethical. But there's an awful lot of ambiguity, and that's what we have. And social life is ambiguous.
Shall we open up to some more questions? We can always do the West later. Joe, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we'll come back to the West at home, but yes.
I was wondering if you'd had any dealings with taxing yourself.
I'm sorry?
If you'd had any dealings with taxing yourself. You've had, your discussion is very...
Maybe I should come in front too,
Which one?
No, it's fine, I'll just lean up against... Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was wondering if you'd had any dealings with taxing yourself. If you'd had any response to...
I have not dealt directly with him, no. And I'm not sure that I have, that there would be very much purchase in it. Of course, I have talked to politicians, and I actually know a couple of the fairly senior politicians in the Democrat Party. I have frequently tried to get to meet Thai politicians because I think it would, that's Thaksin's party, because I think it would actually be useful to get to canvass their opinion on this issue. It's, for various reasons, been hard to do that. One of the people involved in one of the conferences is rumored to be about to become a minister. Nobody actually knows if this is true. We'll watch that situation. But I'm not sure, I mean, I'm making an indirect appeal in my public utterances to Thaksin in the sense that I'm saying, look, if you want an example of a spin-off of your drug policies that actually works in a way that harmonizes with human rights organizations' concerns, Pom-Mahakam is your example. It's perfect, because the leaders of the community have worked hand in glove with the police. They've said to the police, don't invade, we'll take care of it, but you have to give us a sort of citizen's arrest, enhanced citizen's arrest right, so that we can actually bring anyone we catch to you. And that was the deal. And as a result, there was actually no violence involved at all. So rather than my, hoping to get a 2-minute interview with Thaksin, which probably would go nowhere and might simply get me labeled as another interfering anthropologist, I prefer to make statements saying, there is something in the policy that can be worked with, and here is an example that it might qualify.
Thank you. Carrie and then Matt.
That's me. Okay. I wanted to. You contrasted Bangkok and Rome as it was having different kind of community structures and different sort of local responses to what you phrase as a sort of common problem in a way, which is the commodification of heritage. I wondered about the sort of next layer up, say the structure of the mayors or the people you've been calling governors of cities and so on, whether you see them also as having different roles or being somehow politically sort of set up in a different way, or whether they are also samples of westernization. Because I'm thinking about Russia, for example. We never had any mayors, but now Moscow's got a mayor. They're all fantastically important people, all called mayor, the English word, and people vote for them, and they're huge pools of corruption surround them, and so on. So I just wondered really how far upwards your differentiated picture goes.
Well, there are differences between the two countries, and these are also partly historical. People often say that what you see in Thailand is a mixture of the old Saktina or feudal system on the one hand, and some sort of imagined modern Western democratic system. I actually think that most of what Thailand has received from the West in this regard is the old authoritarian Western system. And that's not surprising. I mean, think of the Greek colonels and you immediately have another example of how that works. What one tries to do is to look at the actual behavior of the bureaucrats. There are some things in these encounters that are very, very Thai, and I'm interested, for example, in the use of speech. Now, there's one example, I can't prove this, but one senior bureaucrat came to show how concerned he was, but he also wanted to show that he was an important person, and he wanted to show that there was nothing he could do and nothing he would do. And it was very interesting. He got up and made the speech, and there's a particle in Thai speech that men use, krap, which you use basically as a polite end to any sentence or question. And what he would do is say, you know, I've come here to help you. And then there'd be a pause, and then there'd be the clap. So it was very hard to be sure whether it was ironic or not. And, you know, it was quite dramatic. How many people here speak Thai? Okay, so, you know, he would say something like, you know, "Rao ma chui chu chan." Now, you know, it was a bit noticeable, but it might have just been his normal way of speaking, although when I talked to him privately, he didn't do it, which also makes me think either he was feeling uncomfortable in a public situation. There's a lot of ambiguity. I think that those kinds of things are very specific, and they actually, I want to make a case saying that forms of politeness are crucial to understanding the way in which politics are managed at the local level. Indeed, I was told in very elaborate detail by one marvelous informant in Rome how the mafiosi use politeness. You know that they're mafiosi precisely because they're so polite, and they don't need to be threatening. You know that that kind of rather unctuous politeness is a threat. Now, beyond that, institutionally, because I think your question was really more about institutions, I would say that the governor of Bangkok is caught in a very different situation because he's called a governor because he actually has to report to the government. And it's particularly awkward now that he's on one side of the political spectrum and the government's on the other. But he does have fewer powers than a mayor, and there are mayors all over Thailand, but because Bangkok is the capital, now they want to create a new system with lots of little mayors, and I think that's also a way of perhaps breaking down the centralized power of the Bangkok administration. But he also is the executive who has to put into action acts that have been launched by the central government. So that, for example, the Ratanakosin Island project was actually, and now there's a law case going on right now because it's been pointed out that it was enacted during the military dictatorship and therefore under the new constitution might have no validity. So those kinds of issues complicate his life in ways that I don't think the mayor of Rome would ever have imagined. Then, of course, the whole complication of the royal involvement. I mean, it absolutely, you know, anyone who dares to suggest that there are any divisions in the royal family is, by pointing out the possibility that, you know, there might actually be a lack of unity, is in fact insulting the royal family and is treated in that way and is at risk of being hauled in for lèse-majesté, which I believe now carries a jail sentence of 8 years without appeal. If you're convicted, you know. You can insult the Prime Minister even now to your heart's content. People love to do it, and especially anthropologists apparently, but you can't say anything critical about the royal family. That again complicates the role of the mayor, although the interesting thing is if you contrast the old and the new mayors, or governors, the old mayor behaved very much in the image of the old-style Thai despot, the warrior king, and this man is often regarded as having the best elements of the compassionate image, which actually makes him look very much like the present king, who is very deeply loved and admired by many Thais. So, you know, there are those kinds of symbolic entailments as well. Now, the mayor of Rome actually has a pretty free hand, but Rome is part of the province of Lazio, And just as the Roma football team is left-wing and the Lazio football team is right-wing, so you can imagine the complications that even on public occasions, especially now that elections are coming near, are apt to happen. So it's a very complicated situation as well, but he does have more movement. Also, the present mayor of Rome was a senior member of the Democratic Sinistra and is therefore, and is something of an intellectual who has written some attractive and important books, and therefore has a moral authority that the very young mayor of Bangkok is beginning to acquire through his stylish self-presentation and management. But I think, there are these differences, and certainly they're partly institutional, and partly they have to do with the expectations, the cultural expectations of the roles.